We gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent.
Welcome to Archival. I am your host, Juanita Tolliver, and I am already over the superficial America 250 celebrations. Have y'all been inundated by content, awful commemorative passports, and stories that romanticize U.S. history? Like, yes, sure, the 13 United States of America declared their independence from Britain in 1776, but the patriotic mess flooding social media feeds and televisions doesn't tell even a fraction of the stories that have been integral to U.S. history. You know, the history that has been buried in the archives or simply forgotten. So, of course, that is explicitly what I'm going to explore. The next few episodes of Archival will probe bits of history about people and communities that have worked across generations to try to force this nation to live up to its promises. Promises included in the Declaration of Independence, like all men are created equal, and that they have unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There's also the promise that, quote, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. Considering the hellscape of our current reality under this current government, that line in particular speaks volumes. We have a right and responsibility to challenge and change our government. And that's precisely what the first two people I'm going to highlight in this series accomplished. And they acted with an understanding that every citizen, every person deserved a government that treated them with humanity. I can't remember the first time I heard Mitsuye Endo Tsutsumi's name. Maybe it was in a documentary or a news segment in the 2010s. It could also have been during the campaign for Mitsuye to receive a Presidential Medal of Freedom after the 2020 pandemic. But her name absolutely deserves to be repeated again and again alongside her attorney, James Purcell, because Mitsuye Endo and James Purcell are the chief plaintiff and attorney behind the Supreme Court case that effectively ended Japanese American mass incarceration centers during World War II. This is Archival.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it, and to win the peace that will follow.
Mitsuye Endo was horrified as she read about the attack on Pearl Harbor in the newspaper. Her mind immediately went to her brother. He had been drafted and was serving in the U.S. Army when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, and she was worried about his safety as he was serving in the Pacific. Her next worry was for her job and her own well-being. In January 1942, Mitsuye, or Mitzi as she liked to be called, was a 21-year-old Japanese American working a clerical position at the California Department of Motor Vehicles. She was based in Sacramento and lived with her family, and her state job was stable up until a few weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when she and other Japanese American state employees received a questionnaire that featured intrusive questions about their loyalty to the United States. They wanted to know how much Japanese she spoke, had she been traveling to Japan, as well as her religious affiliations. The questionnaire reflected the discriminatory, anti-Japanese sentiment of many people in the United States at the time, especially those living in and around the Pacific coast. And to be clear, the sentiment stems back to the 1880s and 1890s, when there was an increase in people immigrating from Japan to the United States. Even back then, white Americans express the exact same fears that extremists repeat today, that immigrants are gonna take their jobs and that immigrants are gonna replace them. Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Calvin Coolidge, Congress, and the U.S. Supreme Court all institutionalized anti-Asian discrimination and racism via immigration legislation that stopped Japanese and Chinese laborers from migrating to the United States and implemented immigration caps, and a 1922 ruling that prohibited Japanese people from becoming naturalized U.S. citizens exclusively on the basis of race. With this context in mind, it's not surprising that even Mitsuye's job with the state of California was unsafe. Still, in January 1942, she completed the questionnaire alongside her colleagues. She was a U.S. citizen, born in the country. She did not speak Japanese and had never visited Japan. Even with her lack of connection to Japan, on April 8, 1942, Mitsuye Endo was, quote, rejected and dismissed from her position by the California State Personnel Board. In the book, And Justice for All, an oral history of the Japanese American detention camps, edited by John Tateshi, Mitsuye Endo said, "We were given a piece of paper saying we were suspended because we were of Japanese ancestry." The letter from the Personnel Board was cold and clinical in dismissing the Japanese American workers and stated that, quote, "This action is being taken for the good of the public service, since there is a general lack of confidence on the part of the public and state employees in the loyalty of persons of Japanese ancestry." What a disgusting and heinously explicit example of institutionalized racism and discrimination perpetuated not just by California, but also by the federal government, because President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 in February 1942 and Proclamation No. 1 in March 1942. These orders allowed for forced removal of anyone who was of Japanese descent from the West Coast into mass incarceration detention camps and classified the presence of people of Japanese heritage in Western Washington, Oregon, and California as a national security issue, reinforcing their forced removal from the area. All of this was happening in quick succession. December 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked. January 1942, Mitsuye receives the loyalty questionnaire. February 1942, Executive Order 9066 is signed by Roosevelt. March 1942, Proclamation No. 1 is issued. And April 1942, Mitsuye was officially fired. I'm overwhelmed just revisiting this timeline through history and archives, and I can't imagine the mental and emotional whiplash that Mitsuye and her family and her community were experiencing as all of this unfolded in a hostile environment where anti-Asian hatred and resentment was already present. But in the midst of all of that, Mitsuye and her colleagues were still fighting their dismissals by the California Personnel Board, with support from the Japanese American Citizens League. They were organized and prepared to take collective action as their lives were being actively upended. They were being oppressed at both the federal and state levels. And in that struggle, they also couldn't find legal representation in Sacramento. Saburo Kido, president of the Japanese American Citizens League, was rejected by the attorneys he knew in Sacramento to represent the state employees. So he reached out to an old friend, James Purcell. James was based in San Francisco, and Saburo and James were friends who collaborated on legal cases through the years. And when Saburo described the situation, James Purcell met with some of the employees who had been impacted. Mitsuye described it in the book And Justice for All, saying, quote, "Some of the state of California employees were members of the J Cell, and through them, we got the service of an attorney in San Francisco, Mr. James Purcell, in order to answer the allegations from the state." She seemed to be on the periphery of the J Cell, but welcomed the legal support for her case. Prior to 1942, James Purcell worked on both criminal and civil law in San Francisco after completing his law degree at Stanford in 1930. He went on to open his own practice in 1933, and that's where he became acquainted with Saburo Kida and his Japanese clients. In the midst of the proceedings with the State Personnel Board, Mitsuye and her family were taken into custody, first at the Willarga Assembly Center near Sacramento for 1 month, and then they were transferred to Tule Lake. Now, Tule Lake was one of the biggest detention camps in the nation. It was surrounded by an 8-foot-high fence topped with barbed wire. It featured 28 guard towers, 1,000 military police, and a fleet of armed cars and tanks. At its peak, 18,700 people were incarcerated there. In a 2017 interview with the New York Times, Hiroshi Kashiwagi, a survivor of Tule Lake mass incarceration camp, described how armed guards would shoot people just for getting too close to the fence, and how the barracks were so poorly built that sand would spray in between the wooden boards that served as walls. Soon after Mitsuye and her family were transferred to Tule Lake, a representative for James Purcell visited the camp and presented her and Purcell's other clients with yet another questionnaire. This one was meant to identify what Purcell described as the ideal candidate for a writ of habeas corpus. Mitsuye said, quote, "They thought I had the best background. My brother was in the army, and my parents never went back to Japan. They felt that I represented a symbolic, loyal American." In a letter from the 1970s, Purcell wrote, quote, "She was selected by me because of circumstances of background inconsistent with any charge that might be made against her. She did not speak Japanese. While growing up, her family never subscribed to a Japanese language newspaper. She had never attended a Japanese language school. She was not a Buddhist or a member of the Shinto religion. She was a Methodist. And she had a brother in the United States Army and the Pacific Theater actively engaging the enemy. Still, Mitzi didn't want to be the face of this fight. She said in her oral history, quote, "I was very young and I was very shy, so it was awfully hard to have this happen to me. In fact, when they came and asked me about it, I said, well, can't you have someone else do it first?" I agreed to do it at that moment only because they said it was for the good of everybody. And so I said, well, if that's it, I'll go ahead and do it. In July 1942, Mitsuye was only a 22-year-old who had just had her entire life changed. And it made sense that she didn't want to immediately jump at the opportunity for more disruption and potential abuse at the hands of the federal government. She did not want to be out there. However, what did resonate with her was how her case could impact her entire community and how it could disrupt the federal government's power to remove and detain U.S. citizens without a trial or evidence or anything besides how they look and their ancestry. It's also wild that Mitsuye committed to serving as the chief plaintiff for James Purcell without the two of them ever meeting. "I never talked to Purcell, never met the man," is what Mitsuye Endo said in her oral history edited by John Tateshi. Separately, James Purcell wrote, quote, "I have never met or seen Mitsuye Endo," in a letter to a colleague in the 70s. I'll be honest, y'all, I probably would not trust an attorney whom I've never met to convince me to serve as a chief plaintiff in a test case with national implications. And yes, I remember that James Purcell had already represented Mitsuye in her state employee dismissal case with 62 of her colleagues without ever meeting or speaking to her. Maybe this is just a level of faith and trust that eludes me. But I am so grateful that Mitsuye and James trusted each other. In July 1942, James Purcell filed the writ of habeas corpus petition in the U.S. District Court of Northern California in San Francisco, and he appeared before a judge who scheduled a hearing for the next morning. At that hearing, the judge surprised James by ordering him to proceed with his arguments of the case on the spot. According to a letter that James wrote in 1975, he was surprised, but proceeded to argue his case for hours, highlighting that, quote, the treatment of Japanese Americans was only one step removed, and a very short step at that, from the treatment of some of the people in Germany. Not to mention, after the lunch break, because he argued for hours, the courtroom was filled by military officials and personnel who just so happened to take an interest in the case and decided to sit in. The case files and documents featured in the National Archives also show that Purcell argued that as Mitsuye Endo is a U.S. citizen and as martial law had not been declared, that there had been neither insurrection nor invasion of the United States, and the courts were still fully functioning, and there hadn't been an indictment or a complaint filed in any court against her, then she should not be imprisoned or restrained of her liberty or denied due process or a writ of habeas corpus. And quote, if you can abrogate certain sections of the Constitution and incarcerate any person without trial or charges just because you don't like his nationality, what is to prevent from abrogating any or all of the Constitution? After hearing the case, the judge sat on it for an entire year. He didn't issue a ruling. He didn't call the attorneys back for additional hearings or anything. He simply froze the process with no reason given. Meanwhile, Mitsuye was still incarcerated, and her family had been moved from Tule Lake, California to Topaz, Utah. While she was imprisoned, she was anxious about the case and what was taking so long. Many of her friends had been relocated, and she was ready to get out too. Still, she tried to find some semblance of normalcy in Topaz and started working as a clerical staffer and even met her husband, Kenneth Tsutsumi. Kenneth was a relaxed man who played the ukulele with friends while imprisoned and possessed the most stunning cheekbones, y'all. After 1 year, in July 1943, the U.S. District Court judge ruled against Mitsuye's writ of habeas corpus petition, and James filed an appeal with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. He wrote that the appeals judge asked him what prompted the delayed ruling, which of course James had no information about, and the appeals judge also asked him if he'd be okay with the appeals court certifying the Endo case directly to the Supreme Court. Of course, James was thrilled about that move, especially considering the pressure that the U.S. government had been putting on Mitsuye at the mass incarceration detention center in Topaz. In September 1943, James wrote a letter of warning to Mitsuye that the government was sending Philip Glick, a War Relocation Authority attorney, to offer her release from the camp with conditions. She could leave Topaz, but she could not return to California, and she would have to drop her lawsuit against the federal government. Because if she was free, then she'd have no legal basis. By September 1943, Mitsuye's family had already started leaving and relocating, and she wanted to join her sister in Chicago, Illinois. But even with all of these emotions and feelings, Mitsuye was firm in her commitment to the broader picture and the broader community of incarcerated Japanese Americans. When the War Relocation Authority attorney arrived at the Topaz Detention Center, Mitsuye rejected his offer. She wrote to James Purcell that she was willing to take this case, quote, as far as she could. She was intentional. She was clear and resolute. And all of this as a young person who was surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire in a desolate desert. She knew this case was bigger than her. She also knew that confronting the U.S. government for its inhumane treatment of Japanese Americans was paramount. Ex parte Mitsuye Endo was filed in the Supreme Court on April 22, 1944, and James reiterated his case and effectively responded to the questions from the justices during oral arguments in October 1944. The Supreme Court ultimately issued a unanimous decision in Mitsuye's favor on December 18, 1944. The opinion stated, quote, Mitsuye Endo should be given her liberty and, quote, whatever power the War Relocation Authority may have to detain other classes of citizens, it has no authority to subject citizens who are conceitedly loyal to its leave procedure. When Mitsuye heard about the ruling, she sent a telegram to James that begins with the words, am extremely joyous. And author Tomiko Nomura learned through her research that Mitzi celebrated and danced around her barracks in the Topaz Detention Center with one of her good friends. I was thrilled to read about Mitsuye's joy and celebration, but something weird caught my eye with the dates of the actions of the Supreme Court decision and actions from President Roosevelt's administration, because on December 17th, 1944, just one day before the court's decision was issued to the public, Proclamation number 21 was issued. The proclamation stated that people of Japanese ancestry would be allowed to return to their homes starting in January 1945. So somebody snitched. They gave Roosevelt a heads up to help him save face after years of abuse, unconstitutional abuse against Japanese Americans. James Purcell confirmed as much in a letter, writing that he was told months later that Justice Frankfurter informed the president about the decision the Saturday before it was issued. Mitsuye Endo was dressed in a black skirt suit, black pumps, and a black pillbox hat with a short veil on the day that she left the Topaz Mass Incarceration Center. This one moment effectively captured Mitsuye as she seems to be releasing the years of anxiety and pain and abuse that she and her family faced, that Japanese Americans who were forcibly rounded up alongside her faced, and that the Japanese Americans who also challenged the U.S. government's inhumane actions in the courts faced, though they were not as successful, including Fred Korematsu, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Minoru Yasui. In an interview, Mitsuye's daughter shared that, "My mom said no, she would never go back to California. Mitzi feared targeted violence and harassment, so instead of California, she joined her sister in Chicago and started working for the mayor's office of race relations. She ended up marrying that cute ukulele player, and they started a family together." Mitsuye only gave 2 interviews after this experience, and one of them is featured in the oral history And Justice for All, edited by John Tataishi. In the 1960s and 70s, a full redress reparations movement took hold with support from the Japanese American Citizens League, and James Purcell was in the thick of things, helping clients regain land rights, and even getting state legislation passed to compensate the Japanese American state employees who were wrongfully terminated back in the 1940s. In 1988, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act that provided $20,000 to each survivor of the mass incarceration camps. Here's what President Reagan said at the signing ceremony.
We gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race, for these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent.
In 1998, President Clinton awarded Korematsu with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 2012, President Obama posthumously awarded Gordon Hirabayashi with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and did the same in 2015 for Minoru Yasui. And in January 2025, President Biden posthumously awarded Mitsuye Endo Tsutsumi a Presidential Citizens Medal. Before we close out this episode, I want to share some of the research that nearly got left on the cutting room floor. It's time for my favorite segment, One Last Nugget. Sometimes as I'm perusing the archives, I come across something that makes me scream in shock. And I want to emphasize shock because it's something I never expected and completely changed my thinking about a person. This time that person was James Purcell, the attorney who filed Mitsuye Endo's case and represented the state employees of California without any charge. What I learned shocked me. There was a little note in the University of California Digital Archives catalog which stated that James Purcell, quote, was also the first lawyer to assist San Francisco Supervisor Dan White after his 1978 assassinations of Mayor George Moscone and fellow Supervisor Harvey Milk. Y'all, I gasped. I couldn't wrap my head around it, so I had to search for more information. I found the chief defense attorney's names, but that didn't include James Purcell, so I searched news archives. I didn't see his name there either. So now I'm wondering, why was he the first attorney to assist Dan White? When did he stop assisting Dan White? Did he ever fully stop assisting Dan White or just move to a background role? I have so many questions. I have so many threads to pull. But wow, this stopped me in my tracks, and I just had to tell y'all about it because what? Thank you for listening to Archival. This story is one that I fear the nation has yet to fully internalize, and I hope that my effort to amplify Mitsuye's experiences and her humanity sparks conversations about what we demand of our government and what we're willing to do on behalf of the people who stand beside us. If you enjoyed this episode of Archival, please subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Archival is a production of J. Tolliver Media, LLC.